Hello, welcome to this session. We will hear Sarah Clement Reed. She is assistant professor of history at Brigham Young University. She joined history department in autumn 2018 after completing a PhD in German with a minor in women's studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She wrote her dissertation on Mormonism in the 19th century German literature. At Brigham Young, she teaches classes in Scandinavian, German, and immigration history, Scandinavian and German family history and paleography, and women's studies. Reed is an affiliate faculty member in European Studies, Global Women's Studies, and Scandinavian Studies. Her research and publication areas include Scandinavian American Studies, German American Studies, Mormon Studies, and women writers. So, welcome, Sarah Clement Reed.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here today and to be talking to you about Norwegians in Utah and get to talk about something that perplexes people. Why would Norwegians become Mormon? Why would you live in Utah when you could live in the beautiful, green, wet Midwest, right, as we're experiencing today? I was very happy to see rain after several weeks. So I'm glad to be here. The story of Norwegians in Utah starts with the Mormon Church. And I can't get my clicker to work, so I'm going to be doing a little bit of this today. It was founded in New York by Joseph Smith in 1830, who proclaimed he had seen God and Jesus and other heavenly manifestations. He was given gold plates containing the records of the Israelites in the ancient Americas that he translated and published as the Book of Mormon. Joseph acted as a prophet for his followers and received many revelations and commandments from God, among them the construction of temples, proselytizing, missionary work at home and abroad, and polygamy, as he led his followers west from New York to Ohio to Missouri and finally Illinois. At the time of his death in 1844, the main Mormon settlement of Nauvoo on the banks of the Mississippi River in Illinois had a population of 12,000, which at that time rivaled Chicago at 15,000, so it was quite large. Before it was then abandoned in the winter of 1845-1846 as part of the first stage of the Mormon exodus to Utah. Joseph's successor, Brigham Young, led his followers on a 1,300-mile journey from Nauvoo to the Salt Lake Valley in present-day Utah, a trek over 60,000 people would make before the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869. Mormons colonized the Intermountain West and established the state of Deseret with a commitment to communalism rooted in an agricultural and village-based economy. Mormonism's distance from mainstream America was emphasized by the public admission of the practice of polygamy in 1852 by Brigham Young. Polygamy scandalized the American public and was a frequent sensational subject in the press and a point of political debate. Even as an independent Mormon commonwealth grew, so did the pressure to assimilate into broader American life. This tension increased after the death of Brigham Young in 1877 and coincided with the bid for statehood. President Wilford Woodruff, his successor of Brigham Young, declared an end to the practice of polygamy in 1890, and Utah was finally admitted to the Union in 1896. During the period from about 1880 to 1830, the church abandons many of its idiosyncratic practices, including polygamy, block voting, and economic communalism. Now, I've just shared the standard history of Mormonism in kind of an example of Weber's routinization of charisma. You may have noticed I didn't mention Norwegians or Scandinavians once. Mormon history has tended to focus on the Anglo-American leadership. Indeed, in studying this migration of Europeans broadly, and Scandinavians included in that, scholars have tended to dismiss the experience of Mormon Scandinavians for a few reasons. For some, Scandinavian American Mormons assimilated too quickly into American culture compared to their Scandinavian counterparts in the Midwest. Others posit that the Mormon identity precluded an American or a Scandinavian one, so that Scandinavians became Mormons rather than Americans. Additionally, the tensions within Mormonism's pan-Scandinavianism and within the Anglo-American church leadership has been understudied. So, like I said, for many scholars, we've sort of presupposed that Mormon Scandinavian immigrants gave up all their ethnic identities and national identities to become Mormons. This is kind of a good example of that from William Wilson. He says the Scandinavians did not become Yankees or English, they became Mormons, which is what the Yankees and the English also became. Elsewhere in the United States, immigrants from Europe brought with them their native church, and their church helped them keep up ties with the old world and retain their ethnic identity in the new one. Just the opposite was true in Utah, where pioneer settlers labored to establish a new Zion, which people would put aside ethnic and national differences to become a member of a community of saints. This version of an immigrant assimilation into Mormonism is the standard story in the institutional church as well. And indeed, this was the story they were telling immigrants at the time. The church's highest leaders told the Swedish members in 1903, when they were wanting more Swedish meetings, they said, "The counsel of the church to all saints of foreign birth who come here is that they should learn to speak English as soon as possible, adopt the manners and customs of the American people, fit themselves to become good and loyal citizens of this country, and by their good works show that they are true and faithful Latter-day Saints." And of course, at this period of time, Mormons are also trying to assimilate themselves into broader American culture. So they're done with polygamy, they're getting done with block voting, they've given up communalism, they're trying to be part of the national political, social, and economic mores. Given this, we need to be aware that they're also saying this because there were issues happening at the time. So people were not giving up their identities. They were not assimilating the way that they wanted them to assimilate. And so we shouldn't take this story at face value. We should be aware of the holes that are in this. And indeed, we should be wary of what historian of Mormonism Jan Ships has called the donut hole problem of Mormon history. She comments that many, if not most, historians of the West shape the Western story like a donut, so circling all around the Great Basin, taking into account nearly every Western story except the Mormon one. So historians of the American West connect the histories of the areas around Utah with each other, but not the story in Utah with what was going on outside. The opposite is also true. In the donut hole, Mormonism determines everything and is isolated from the rest of America. Mormon historians like Ships and others have done a good job demonstrating how connected the Mormon cultural region actually was to the rest of America. More recent scholars than the ones cited before, like Jennifer Eastman Atterbury, Lynn Hendrickson, Julie Allen, Elizabeth Peterson, Frida Ulvund, Jenny Lund, who's here, have challenged this conventional narrative to show that there was a complex process of immigration and assimilation and a lasting set of affiliations for Scandinavians in the Mormon cultural region, beyond their new religious identity. Their work has helped bridge the gap between Mormon studies and Scandinavian American scholarship, which has acknowledged the Mormon migration from Scandinavia, but has tended not to integrate it into the history. So this presentation today will explore some aspects of Norwegian life in Utah in a variety of sources, and how immigrant Norwegian Mormons in Utah have all of these different kinds of identities: Norwegian American, and Mormon, even if these identities were contested by others. These national, ethnic, and religious identities produce a set of transnational affiliations available in a global church and a nation of immigrants. Integrating rather than ignoring Norwegians in Utah can help us understand the process of immigration and assimilation better for all parts of this mass migration from Norway. And it can help us avoid the donut hole theory of both Mormon and Norwegian American history. And as I speak today, I'm sure you'll hear some points of convergence and divergence with the dominant narrative about Scandinavian and Norwegian American history and what that was like. As I go through some of these sources, I'll talk and different themes. Some I'll talk more in depth about, some I will speak more briefly about to give you kind of an overview of both and a few more intimate looks at some of these experiences. Okay. The first Scandinavians to convert to Mormonism were the Norwegian immigrants in Fox River settlements in Illinois, followed by similar groups in Iowa and Wisconsin. And if you were at Liv Marit Håkenstad's presentation yesterday, she talked a lot about some of the sloopers who joined the Mormon Church and those early Norwegian converts in Illinois, and then also where they came to in Utah. So Norwegians were a part of the church pre-Utah. So these early Norwegian converts were in Illinois, and the church was still led by Joseph Smith. Even after then the assassination of their prophet in 1844 and their flight west in the following years under the leadership of Brigham Young, Mormons' vision of a global gospel persisted. These early Norwegian American converts became some of the first missionaries to Denmark, following the adoption of a liberal constitution protecting freedom of religion in 1849 in that country. These Mormon missionaries found success converting Danes to their American religion and continued on in subsequent years to Sweden and Norway. As a part of this expansive theological imperative to gather the saints to Zion, and by that they mean Utah in this context, thousands of Mormon Scandinavians immigrated to the United States and settled throughout the Mormon cultural region during the second half of the 19th century. And here's some numbers for you. Comparatively, you can see that the Danes we start in the 1850s, the Norwegians we have the most from Norway, and then the missionary work in Denmark kicks in, and the Danes dominate in terms of numbers, followed by Swedes and then Norwegians down there. There's also a Icelandic mission and success, but they're less integrated with the other Scandinavian stories. By 1900, 34% of the population in Utah was foreign-born, and 16% of the population was from Scandinavia. So quite a large percentage in Utah was foreign, and also quite a large from Scandinavia. Immigration from Scandinavia peaked in 1900, but by then, formal and informal settlements, church groups, co-ops, organizations, all sorts of social institutions had formed throughout the region around a shared Scandinavian identity. So these communities were made up not only of native Danes, Swedes, and Norwegians, but also second and third generation Scandinavian Americans. And it was a Scandinavian, initially, kind of mandate that they all kind of worked together. The personal writings of Norwegian converts to Mormonism show that they maintained their ethnic identity even after conversion and immigration. In particular, correspondence shows how they preserved their kinship networks among Norwegians on both sides of the Atlantic. For an example today, I'm going to use the Woodsoe family papers held at the Church History Library in Salt Lake City. Anna Woodsoe was a widow with 2 young children living in Trondheim when she was introduced to the Mormon church through some neighbors. Through these neighbors and the help of missionaries, she converted and was baptized in 1881. Because of the encouragement to gather together in Zion and Utah, and as in the case with many other Scandinavian converts, she immigrated to Utah in 1883. There she lived in Logan, a little bit north of Salt Lake, in a Norwegian community, including some of the Norwegian-born missionaries who had converted her and sponsored her immigration. Her sister Lena was also baptized into the Mormon Church in 1883 and immigrated to Salt Lake in 1885. The sisters worked as seamstresses and were prominent members of the Norwegian American community in Utah throughout this time. In the early 1900s, they returned to Norway as missionaries and reconnected with friends and families they had left behind 20 years earlier. Anna's sons were very successful in their church and secular pursuits. Both attended Harvard and both became professors at universities in Utah. Her older son, John, later became an apostle in the church, so that's the second highest governing body in the church. Anna kept up an extensive correspondence with all sorts of people, but particularly with her sister Lena and her sons, but also Norwegian friends and family who were both Mormons and Lutherans in the US and in Norway. These letters fit perfectly within the genre of the America letter, the America Brev. They give us a personal view of a woman's conversion to Mormonism and subsequent immigration to Utah. These personal views can add complexity to the standard narrative we have about Norwegian Mormon immigrants. Anna is fervent in her testimony of Mormonism, but does not see that replacing her Norwegianness or precluding making a successful life in the U.S. The letters sent to Anna reveal her place in overlapping circles of belonging. Most prominent in the letters are those from Norwegians living in Utah, either returned missionaries or recent immigrants, but she also corresponds with family and friends in Norway. She writes extensively to her sister Lena after she's in the US and Lena's still in Norway. Here she describes her journey to the US, sailing from Oslo to Hull, taking the train to Liverpool to catch the boat to New York, and then taking the train to Utah and to Logan, where her Norwegian friends have helped set her up. And if you're familiar with the process of transmigration for Norwegians, this is perfectly in line with what everyone else was doing. She's setting up her new life in the US. In Utah, she starts telling Lena things she should do and to prepare to immigrate. She should try to learn as much English as she can because she has a hard time understanding English in Logan. But she's hoping that in the next couple years she'll be able to speak better. She talks about the different Christmas traditions that they have in America and is even a little bit contemptuous of her fellow Norwegians who have adopted some of them. She is glad that she's come to Utah when she has, sometime after the original settlement, because she said the town's been built up, the irrigation's going, and we have mature trees. So she's not into the settler lifestyle. She's happy that it's there. And she has high hopes for her boys that they'll have freedom to succeed in America. When Lena prepares to come to the U.S., Anna's letters are filled with her concern about material needs. She tells her exactly what fabrics and materials to bring with her and which stores to buy them from. I'm an older sister, so I can be very, I understand this need to tell your little sister what to do, right? She tells her to bring a sewing machine because she doesn't like the ones in Utah. She tells her there aren't very many good seamstresses in Utah, so they'll be really successful. She buys her ticket for her, sends it with some cash and a letter. If Lena has any extra room, Anna has one request. After nearly 2 years in the high deserts of the Rocky Mountains, she would like some flowers from her native land, including 2 myrtles with strong roots, several bulbs of Mrs. Ryan's white lilies, and as many bulbs as possible as Jacob's lilies, and whatever other rare flowers she can bring. And she said, put them in a tight cigar box with good soil and water them on the way. She says, I brought 2 little boys with me. Your flowers can't be any more trouble than them. So she finishes the letter with her testimony of the LDS Church because she says she knows Lena will be visiting her friends and family before she immigrates and will share the letter. And as you can see here, it's a well-read letter that's been passed around and dog-eared. She shares her conviction of the truthfulness of the gospel and the greatness that it will come from it, as well as the many freedoms she now enjoys, including the freedom to travel back to Norway to visit her with her son. So she's already thinking she'll go back to Norway sometime. Anna's deep religious conviction is complemented by her sense of Norwegianness. Her ethnic identity enhances rather than competes with her religious identity. Like the many flowers she hopes Lena will bring to help make the high mountain deserts of Utah a little more like their Norwegian home. Like immigrant letters from non-Mormons, Anna's correspondent reveals similar hopes and challenges for Norwegians finding their new life in America, from building community with fellow countrymen to the economic and material challenges to balancing forces of assimilation with hopes for the next generation. In some ways, the Scandinavian convert women were the public face of Mormonism. In the 19th century, the large number of Mormon immigrants was a concern to many in the United States. Many of these concerns mirrored general anti-immigrant sentiments of the time, while some were targeted specifically at Mormons. Polygamy was a primary political concern and one that received a lot of traction in the popular press as well as political discourse. And I don't have time to really get into the long history here, but the federal government was not into polygamy. They're still not into polygamy. So, and a lot going on to try to stop that. Scandinavian women in the popular press are depicted as victims of Mormonism and their lecherous intent. Here's an example, the twin relics of barbarism. That's a phrase that comes from a Republican Party platform that said we were going to get rid of the twin relics of barbarism, slavery, and polygamy. And here, it's, the caption goes on, the wolves and the lambs, arrival of Scandinavian converts in the charge of Mormon missionaries at Castle Garden en route for Salt Lake City. So you can see these older Mormon men who are looking lecherously at these young Scandinavian women in their folk costumes. So these women are the object of desire for these men. Here's another one seen in Castle Garden on the arrival of Mormon converts from Europe. Here you see this kind of idea that they're coming with lots of kids and they're in their old European fashions here. And then we have Mormonism in Utah, the Cave of Despair. So these Scandinavian, if you can see, some of them are labeled as which countries they're coming from, including Norway and they're in European folk costumes. The menacing skull there, Utah, and off to the left it says Mountain Meadows, which refers to a massacre committed by Mormons on a wagon train from Arkansas. So this idea that these poor Scandinavian converts are headed to their death, basically. And also on their little tags on their knapsacks, it says sealed. So referring to the term for marriage in a Mormon temple. So all these women, the idea is they've been sealed polygamously to some Mormon man. Migration brought with it settlement and the dispossession of native lands. Mormonism's foundational text, the Book of Mormon, is an account of the Old Testament origins of the native population of the Americas, and early Mormons believed that the Indian tribes in the United States were descendants of the characters in the scriptures, who are known collectively as the Lamanites. As such, Native Americans were an integral part of Mormonism's narrative, the sacredness of America, and the preservation and restoration of Christ's church in the New World. Proselyting efforts in Indian territory began already under Joseph Smith. Scholar Paul Reeve has demonstrated how Mormons themselves began to be racialized in popular discourse in a similar way as Indians in the 19th century. This was especially true after Mormons moved west and seemingly went native to the civilized world. Mormons, however, had a much more complicated relationship with Indians in the Mormon culture region as they baptized, married, ordained, murdered, indentured, befriended, fought with, traded with, employed, warred against, and ultimately aided in the displacement of Native Americans to reservation. And that's Reeves' description. Mormons certainly participated in the colonization of the American West with the attendant displacement of native populations and their cultural assimilation. The Black Hawk War is a good example of this. And this picture is by Dan Vigeland, who was a Norwegian painter and sometimes called the father of Utah art. And he had many depictions of indigenous people, adding to sort of Mormon visual culture and how they depicted natives. The Black Hawk War is a series of violent conflicts between Mormon settlers and the Utes and their allies in 1865 and 1872 in central Utah. Most of this war happened in Sanpete County, which is heavily Scandinavian. Yet histories of the war focus on the Anglo-American leadership. I had an RA of mine go through and start looking to see if there was Scandinavian participation in the Black Hawk War, and we found extensive Scandinavian participation. And they played a role, both direct and indirect, as participants in that. A good example of this, and I'll just mention this briefly, would be the examples of Olaf Larsen and Knut Petersen. Olaf Larsen was born in Drammen in 1836, and he was one of the instigators of the Circleville Massacre during this war. Members of the Kusharam Southern Paiute Band were rounded up and imprisoned in Circleville in central Utah. One of these Paiute was shot while trying to escape. Fearing reprisal, Olaf Larsen, with others, decided to execute the remaining 27 prisoners, including the women and children. This event was finally memorialized in Circleville in 2016. Contrasting with that is Knut Petersen, born in 1824 in Eidfjord, and he was a prominent Norwegian leader, and he is credited with helping to bring the peace in the war. In 1866, Petersen met with Chief Blackhawk and worked out an agreement to end hostilities. The juniper tree where this peace treaty was reached was preserved, and I believe is still there. A monument to that was placed in 1982. So you have sort of, and Knut was remembered at the time and celebrated at the time. I'm looking at Jenny Lund because she knows more about Knut than I do, as somebody who brought peace to this region, whereas the Circleville Massacre is something that was forgotten. So we have different kinds of memory playing on here and different kinds of participation. Missionary work challenged sometimes families at home when they were left without a provider, but also gave Mormons an opportunity to return to their countries of origin, to proselytize and to help enforce patterns of chain migration. According to Reed Nielsen, nearly 80% of the missionaries who served in the Scandinavian mission from 1850 to 1899 were born in Denmark, Sweden, or Norway. But that the majority of missionaries that were living in Utah at the time of their call returned to the country of their birth. And that second and third generation Scandinavian Americans could have the opportunity to temporarily return to Scandinavia as missionaries and have a very different experience than their immigrant forefathers, one that could potentially socialize them as Scandinavians and Mormons while representing America. One example here is Clarence Johansson's missionaries' diaries and scrapbooks. Clarence was a second-generation Scandinavian American. His father was born in Denmark. His mother was a Norwegian American. His maternal grandparents were from Norway. Here on the first page of his scrapbook, we see on the left a cutout of the program of his missionary farewell, so kind of the event they held before he left at his mission at the Norwegian congregation. So he had ties to the Norwegian language congregation in Salt Lake. And then on the right, we see the first thing that he has in his scrapbook is commemorating, memorializing Roald Amundsen. The rest of the scrapbook is full of articles cut out from secular Norwegian newspapers and Mormon church periodicals, showing his interest in Norwegian news and culture. He keeps some of his diaries in Norwegian and some of his diaries in English. His letters to his parents are written in a mixture of English and Norwegian. And he was on his mission in the late 1920s. Also in his scrapbook, put in much later, is an ad for a retirement home in the 1990s, and it has a little biography of Clarence Johansson and says he was a missionary in Norway and met Roald Amundsen before he disappeared, and that he married a Norwegian woman later. And wouldn't you love to live in a retirement home with Clarence? Is sort of the ad. An interesting choice of doing this, but I love that his mission experience is still central to his identity 70 years later. Now, it wasn't a given that migrating to Utah would guarantee that a Norwegian or Mormon would stay Mormon. In the Mormon cultural region, the specter of excommunication worked to keep economically vulnerable colonies together across ethnic lines, although Scandinavians managed to establish predominance in some settlements, for example, in Sanpete County in central Utah. At the same time, the lure of fertile farms and established ethnic communities in the Midwest prompted a significant amount of back migration as Scandinavian converts left Utah and Mormonism. There was also a counter-mission in Utah by the Lutheran Church to reconvert Mormon Scandinavians to Lutheranism. This was done by Danish Lutherans, Norwegian Lutherans, and Swedish Lutherans. I have an interesting, this is from the Norwegian Lutherans. I have from the history of the Augustana Synod, which is Swedish. They talk a little bit about the failures in Utah. It was known as the hardest mission for the Lutherans. And it states, the Mormon missionaries, sadly enough, had been quite successful in their proselytizing efforts among the people of Scandinavia. Thousands of misguided souls from these countries were found in Utah, some of them still loyal to the pagan errors into which they had apostatized. Others had lost faith in all religion. Others, again, had plunged into the grossest superstition. I wonder what that was. Could something be done for the saving of these benighted souls? Well, were they successful? The history goes on to say, after nearly 30 years of great financial expenditure, hard work, prayers, and tears, the results, if measured by the number of church members, is small indeed. And then it says, but of course, basically any soul that's brought to Christ is worth the effort, right? Which is a familiar refrain to, I think, all mission cultures. Several of the Lutheran churches on the Wasatch Front trace their origins to these mission work. Even if they're not successful in their day, they stay here. In Utah, there was a policy of pan-Scandinavianism. Scandinavians lived together in communities. They established businesses, newspapers, associations, congregations all together while retraining their native languages. Despite linguistic, ethnic, and national differences, the LDS Church promoted an official policy of pan-Scandinavians where they said, you ordain Swedes, Norwegians, but you should all work together, you should celebrate your holidays together, other cultural practices, share your religious meetings, and belong to the same kind of ethnic organization, which was all primarily under the leadership of the Danish members. This mostly worked, but by the turn of the 20th century, tensions had increased, especially with the Swedes. Many Swedish immigrants lived in more urban areas than other Scandinavians, and as time went on, Swedish immigrants tended to be from farther north in Sweden and had a harder time understanding the Danes, if anyone actually can understand the Danes. The Swedes were kind of led by a newspaper man, Odo Riedman. There was a newspaper that was meant for all Scandinavians called Bikuben. It became the official newspaper from the church for Scandinavians. But the Swedes wanted their own newspaper. Odo Riedman had made a newspaper for them. And he started favoring in his newspaper separate Swedish meetings and organizations. He put a lot of this agitation into print, and that put him in direct conflict eventually with church leaders, and they excommunicated him in 1902. This led to an uproar among Swedish Mormons who circulated a petition and staged a mass protest. This is called the Swedish Uprising. And the church said, no, you have to keep going with the Danes. And then a few years later, let them have their separate congregations, let them have an official separate newspaper. So they got what they want eventually. It's at this time, just shortly after this, that the Norwegians start their own newspaper. It's called Varden. Old Lovell is called Norwegian newspapers the primary expression of resilience of Norwegian American culture. Its interaction rather than assimilation with American society and its influence on cultural, social, and political fabric of the American social order. And I think Varden demonstrates this resilience as it tries to balance these different identities. Until its publication, Norwegians had contributed to the Scandinavian newspapers. And there were a number of newspapers, I mentioned a couple, some of them were explicitly Mormon, some of them were explicitly anti-Mormon, but mostly in Danish and then some Swedish. And even so, many of these newspapers had assumed the cooperation of Scandinavian Mormons, or it was sort of anti-Danish, chafing at the Danish custodianship of Scandinavian church life. So these newspapers were reacting for or against the dominant religion in the state. This lone Norwegian newspaper reflects these ethnic and religious tensions for Norwegian immigrants, but attempts to accommodate and integrate Norwegian and Norwegian American identities without challenging Scandinavian mandate or competing with the other Danish or Swedish newspapers. The editors in the beginning try to avoid some of these pitfalls by saying, we're just going to be Norwegian, we're not going to be religious or political. We're just going to enjoy Norwegian literary and folksy content in the Norwegian language. So their important point from the beginning is that that Norway and a connection to Norwegian is preserved. They say, we believe we'll do a good job if we can do something to spread true Norwegianness, national thoughts and feelings among our countrymen, to teach them to love their mother tongue and the people who are their own, who will live with them one day, as the poet says. Teach them that we are a people and should therefore stand together, have common interests and a common purpose. If we can preserve the love of fatherland and mother tongue, and then the characteristics and attributes that we possess and maintain as a people, become the traits which we so dearly need in these our new relationships, so that we should not be swallowed up by the maelstrom in which everyone struggles for the almighty dollar and where the means are so often not taken into account. So I see this as them attempting to create a Norwegian community in Utah, one that remembers Norway and speaks Norwegian, but also one that's situated in the US and is forward-thinking about future generations in a decidedly American capitalist milieu. The periodical editors do their best to fulfill these goals by taking a romantic view of Norwegian nationalism, an optimistic view of Norwegian Americans, a practical view of Americanism, and a cultural view of Mormonism. Over the 2-year run, they included content related to prominent Mormon Norwegians, well-known Norwegian Americans in the Midwest, and Norwegian luminaries in Norway, as well as news from around the world, Norwegian language fiction, histories of Utah and America and Norway, and always a full page of jokes, only about half of which I find funny. Together, the periodical makes a composite identity for them. Let me show you some. So for example, they run a biography of Bjørnson. He happens to die during the run of the newspaper, and they are talking a lot about his the memorial service they're going to be holding in Salt Lake for him. And they always include this above their news for Norway. I like that little graphic of carrying Norway like a backpack. Prominent Norwegian Americans, Ole Bull is featured. They definitely believe that the Kensington Stone is real and the Vikings made it to Minnesota, so they are very invested in these Norwegian American stories about that. They also feature local prominent Norwegians. This one is author Nephi Anderson that I'll talk about briefly here in a moment. They have news from the colony, from Utah, all over Utah, that it has a circulation throughout the state. This is from the May issue when they're celebrating Constitution Day, and they have the songs for Norway, America, and Utah in there. So they're trying to promote all of these different identities. Even so, they never have any explicit Mormon content. For example, other Mormon newspapers would have speeches given by prominent leaders. They would have news of missionaries and things like that. This doesn't include that unless one happens to write in, but it's not reporting on the Mormon church in the way others are. The newspaper closed after 2 years. The editors claimed it was too popular, they couldn't keep up with it. I hope that's true. But they hope that it had served its purpose. I'll tell you briefly about this author, Nephi Anderson. His family was converted to the Mormon Church in Norway, and he immigrated as a child. He worked as a teacher and later for the church in or later for the Utah Genealogical Society. He served missions back in Norway as well as in England and in Missouri. He became a prominent writer in Mormonism in the early 20th century. It is often called Mormonism's most popular author. His most influential work, Added Upon, sold extremely well and was in print until the 2000s, so that's quite a long time. His other novels were popular and beloved, including novels about Norwegians. So here we have a book called Daughter of the North, and this is from the frontispiece where you have, it says Norden, so you have a representation of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. And Norway's looking out to the future because the future is bright for Norway. We're going to become independent. We're going to be looking here in the future. In this book, the heroine is quite heroic. She's a good sailor and saves some people who had been shipwrecked. She joins the Mormon Church and it gets her boyfriend to join the Mormon Church. She loves Ibsen and Bjornson. She's kind of the perfect Norwegian girl, looking and going to immigrate to the United States. In the book, The Castle Builder, it follows the story. It's kind of one of these farm boy stories of where you kind of raising yourself up from your poverty through education, and he gets involved in politics, wants an independent Norway, who wants to be ruled by Sweden and their French kings, right? And then he meets the Mormons and understands that, joins the Mormon Church and immigrates. All of these books were written in English, so it makes you think there's this way in which he is making a statement to Anglo-Americans about what it's like to be an immigrant in Mormonism and what it's like to be Norwegian. So there seems to be also this element of trying to explain that part and creating a identity that begins to be post-vernacular. After the end of mass migration, changes to the federal laws in the 1920s restricted the numbers of Norwegians immigrating to Utah. Simultaneously, that doctrine I've been calling the gathering to Zion, that is migrating to Utah, was phased out of church practice as it was impractical from a legal perspective and from a settlement perspective. With no influx of native speakers, the language shift from Norwegian to English was accomplished in a few generations in the second half of the 20th century. So Norwegians in Utah needed to find a way to create a post-vernacular identity. One of these ways is by promoting famous Norwegians in Utah. For example, I mentioned Dan Vigeland. So through a legitimation process, we have great artists, we're great people. Another example would be Torleif Knaphus, a sculptor who worked on a lot of Mormon art that's found on temples or in other monuments. The Angel Moroni Monument in New York at the Hill Cumorah, this quite famous handcart pioneer statue, which was then a copy was given to the Norwegian Immigrant Museum in the 2000s. So as a symbol both of, hey, we're part of this story, this Norwegian immigrant story, and we also have great people who went to Utah. We're not all crazy polygamists. We also produce great art. More recently, there are the skiers Alf Engen and Stein Eriksen who helped put skiing into Utah as a prominent part now of the economy. Like places in the Midwest, Norwegian identity is celebrated through festivals. This is the program from the Constitution Day, 17. Mai program in 1914 that continues today. And this year it was particularly cool in Utah in May, so people could wear their bunads without sweltering too much on that day. At the same time, historically, pan-Scandinavian gatherings in Utah happened at midsummer, but today that's the purview of the Swedes and the Swedish Heritage Society. So rather, the Scandinavian festival for Utah happens in Ephraim in Sanpete County, and it's only 50 years old, which makes you kind of think about questions of ethnic revitalization in the mid-20th century. It's the town's main festival, and there have been attempts to make it more Scandinavian in the last few years. They've had the international folk team from BYU, where one of the directors is Danish, and she comes down for that. If you throw enough flags on, it becomes Scandinavian, right? They also have a Viking encampment there. They have a Scandinavian crafts area. Some attempts to try to understand what does it mean to be Scandinavian in a post-vernacular situation. So in conclusion, the Norwegian experience in Utah is layered by these competing identities, but I think we can see that it is similar to other parts of Norwegian American experience, as well as points of divergence that can help us understand better the role of religion, the role of the region, and the role of your ethnic milieu in the assimilation process in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you for an interesting speech. And we have time for questions. And here is the microphone. Gunnar Nedheim from Norway.
Nice listening to you.
Thank you.
I mean, when you showed the table, I mean, it's very evident that most Danish, Swedes, and then Norwegians. We talked a little bit, many Norwegians came from small towns in southern and eastern Norway along the coast. And they were not so bad treated as those in Trøndelag. But according to the law, you mentioned those in Trondheim, and so I came across material there. The sheriff just put them into jail, and without anything, they were sitting there for a year or two, and then when they were left out, we moved to Salt Lake City. So there are different treatments, but we didn't have it easy. Much harder than the Quakers, that's for sure. Much, much harder. Then I use, back to your graphs, transport, okay? What you described as the typical woman in her letters, she took the Wilson line, probably from Trondheim to Ålesund to Bergen, and then across to Hull. So the Wilson line began transporting people from Denmark, Gothenburg, Norway, after the Civil War. But I have read some articles about how the Mormons made full transport line from Denmark to Norway to Britain, and we had full ships, and not all of them entered New York City. Some went to Philadelphia, and then they had also a transport line within the United States of how, and this is before a railroad, how to get them to Utah and all this. I know there is some, I have articles, I can't remember the names of them, but it's very interesting. And England was a center for all this, and they arranged through Scandinavia to Britain and further. Have you come across some of this?
That's a pretty typical way they're doing it. That you have this need on the side of the church to kind of shepherd the migration, so they came together, often with missionaries returning home, and it's pretty well documented along those lines. The federal government at one point tried to ask European countries, don't let these Mormons immigrate. And the European countries were like, well, it's good business for us, and we get rid of the Mormons, right? So there, yeah.
Yeah, Liverpool was made to the central LDS city. I think I started out in London. I had a speech in April about it. And then they rented ships or lines. They went to Guion line especially, and rented ships from them and took Mormons over. But not just from Liverpool and Hull, the transmigration, but also from Denmark and other places.
Yeah, if you're interested in that, there's quite a good database called Saints by Sea that has tried to document all the saints who came from the Mormons who came from Europe by boat, with the material, with most of the material that they have on that. We're giving Kari a workout.
Thank you, Sarah. That was really interesting. I was wondering about the missionaries that you talked about, and I was the Norwegian. I'm especially interested in the Norwegian female missionaries, but just the early Norwegian missionaries. Were they mostly sent back to Norway, or were they from early on sent to the whole world? And is there anything written about these Norwegian missionaries that were sent out when they were still Norwegian, speaking in Norwegian?
Yeah, there's been some done on that, but not a lot. So most of them went back to these places, but they could go other places. So, for example, I mentioned Anna Woodsoe, talked about her immigrant letters, and she returned to Norway with her sister. She was one of the first sister missionaries, so one of the first female women missionaries. And went back to Norway. Her son Osborne got sent to Tahiti on his mission, and in his letters back to his mother, he says, "It's really good I'm here because actually Norwegians are really good at learning languages, and I'm doing much better than my Anglo counterparts, basically." So it's this interesting kind of, oh, we're the best wherever we are kind of thing. But yeah, for the most part, the statistics seem to indicate they did go back to a country of origin, though. Yeah.
You have one more, Sarah?
Yeah.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. I was thinking a lot about this, particularly when you were talking about the Mormon Norwegian immigrant experience, and then reflecting on sort of the larger, if we will, Midwestern Norwegian experience here.
Yeah.
And in particular, I got thinking about the writings that you were talking about, whether it was in Varden or the books and such, and that seemed to be kind of trying to hang on to Norwegianness as much. And then contrasting that with Rolvåg, who, in Giants in the Earth, which everybody has read, is about being Norwegian, but then the subsequent books, that Their Father's God and all those that come along, where immediately it's the more, I don't want to say typical, but average, maybe lose your ethnicity, become American narrative that happens. And I don't know if you've thought about that at all, but I think it's kind of interesting that there's at least from your talk, it seems like there's a greater emphasis on hanging on.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I would love to think about that more, because there's this sort of need in some of these, in Anderson's book, is need to prove we're good Mormons and we're great Norwegians. The Norwegians are a great people, right? And the Americanness is kind of on the side in a way, right? And looking at some of the anxieties that's being expressed in these writings, right, is be interesting. Thank you.
I found your talk very informative, and one of the slides I know you had about Knut Peterson,
Yeah.
who was a missionary, and I believe he married one of the children of one of the sloopers.
Yes.
And then I was just amazed at how many people that came back from Scandinavia with him. I believe he went to Norway and then also went to Denmark and brought hundreds of people. And I was curious if you or Jenny Lynn could say just a little bit more about him.
Jenny, do you want to answer that? Jenny Lund is writing a biography on him. But yes, a prominent, very prominent leader, in part because of the connection in the missionary work and early Norwegian immigration.
Yeah, and so he brings all those people because he is returning so it's not him collecting people, he's returning as a mission from his mission, he's finished. And so the church appoints him to be the shepherd to this large group of people that is immigrating. He's got a great sense of humor, and he's a very, he's a very polarizing figure in Utah. Some people hated him and referred to him as King Canute, and other people just adored him. But a lot of those immigrants who came with him, they adored him. So you can see he's got these really strong leadership skills, and he's the one who makes sure they get on the boat, that the captain and crew don't abuse them, that they get their food, they get off the boat, they get to the right place, they get on the train, they get on a wagon train. He leads the wagon train to Utah the first time in 1856. So he's really got those skills. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Yes. I think the time has gone, and we thank Sarah and all of you for coming.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.